Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video what I want to do is talk a little bit about Kevin Nontradicath's video on why he is a moral anti-realist. Now, this, I guess, is a response video, but I actually agree with him on a lot of things, and I'm just really trying to continue this conversation and explore these ideas. If you're watching this, Kevin, hello. My guess is you are, because you tend to be pretty responsive and things and pretty open to dialogue. So yeah, I don't really want to, I mean, maybe I'll point out where I disagree here, but I don't want this to seem like, even my standard response videos can be a little more harsh, and this is not what I'm doing here. I'm just going to explain my position because I thought this was a good video that brought up some really interesting points, and I like this paper that he cites as well. So this is Kevin's video. I used to think his last name was Nontradicath. I think Joe Schmidt also thought the same thing, maybe, as I did. Maybe not, but no, I think Nontradicath is just non-traditional Catholic. So that's what Kevin's going to be talking about, and we're going to be talking about moral realism, moral anti-realism, and this relationship to gastronomical realism. So I'm going to speed this up.
Back when I was Catholic, I was a moral realist, though I may not have used that title. I think that the Catholic position on morality is captured pretty clearly in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Part 3, Section 1, Chapter 1, Article 4, the morality of human acts. Line 1749 reads, "Freedom makes man a moral subject. When he acts..."
So this particular point, I don't want to comment too much on this because I'm not a Catholic, so I can't say too much, but I do think this is very interesting when he cites this particular thing, that morally good acts requires the goodness of the end and of the circumstance together. Notice this ends piece. This is very similar, perhaps not surprisingly, to Thomas Aquinas. So this is basically saying there needs to be an end. The end needs to be good as well, but the means, it's like the means and the ends has to line up. Catholic, from what I understand, Catholic and Christian morality, it's not an ends justify the means kind of thing. So that's kind of what he talks about here. Like I said, because I'm not a Catholic, my opinion on this or my thoughts on this is probably not all that helpful. So let's see.
Any Catholic teaching that says moral facts exist or moral realism is true or anything like that. As far as I can tell, the church works from an assumption that moral realism is true and then acts accordingly.
Yeah, I would guess that I would agree with Kevin on this. Yeah, I think the Catholic Church, from what I understand, and he's going to know more about it than I will, acts on an assumption that moral realism is true. And I would say, yeah, I think Christianity in general does. I think it'd be very odd to find a Christian who's a moral anti-realist. I'm sure there's some out there. I've just never encountered any or seen any of them write anything about this. So that is what it is. Obviously, they can disagree. You're going to find Christian deontologists and Christian virtue ethicists. Christian utilitarianists, not as much. I don't think I've ever met a Christian utilitarian strictly, but they may have adopted some principles from utilitarianism. We'll talk about this sort of the three main moral theories, which is virtue ethics, deontology, and virtue ethics. Wait, did I say that already? Utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and deontology in a little bit.
Defining how we evaluate moral acts and how to act in a moral manner. Catholics, if I'm wrong about this, please let me know. But when I started dropping my beliefs that I was supposed to hold as a Catholic, I held on to my belief in moral realism. My intuition was so strong, and I didn't see any reason to drop my belief in moral realism. And besides, I didn't want to give up my belief in moral realism. I took great comfort in the black and white nature of morality that was instilled in me as a traditionalist Catholic. And I carried that with me considerably longer than I held my belief that the Catholic Church is the one true church.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the same boat as Kevin in the sense that I really want to believe that moral realism is true. And obviously, if there is no such entity like God, or there's no such moral order to the universe, whether or not that relies on God, that's not really what I'm going to talk about too much today. But I think that's a very appealing thing. And one of the things, for instance, just take anything we would think would be black and white. When we talk about moral anti-realism, what we're basically saying is that these statements are just meaningless. And this often comes from the sort of logical positivism from the Vienna Circle. But things like saying, rape is wrong. If you're a moral anti-realist, you're basically committed to saying that somebody who says rape is wrong and somebody saying, I think rape is okay because it makes me feel good, these are both equally valid because they both have no substance to them, or they're just as valid as somebody liking vanilla ice cream and somebody liking chocolate ice cream, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. But it's important to point out this, I guess, why to most of us, or to a lot of us, or to at least myself, moral realism is a very appealing kind of position.
For a while, I called myself a moral realist a la Sam Harris. Sam Harris, in his 2010 book, The Moral Landscape, argues that science can answer moral questions.
There's an interesting response to Sam Harris in The Moral Landscape by CCKPhilosophy. I'll provide a link to that video in the description. Very interesting video, very worth watching. The main complaint I have against Sam Harris, and also a book that James Davison Hunter and Paul Niedeleski wrote Science and the Good, The Tragic Quest for the Foundations of Morality, or the Scientific Foundations of Morality. Kind of goes after Sam Harris for the same thing, claiming he's bridged this Hume's is-ought gap, which I think is a little tricky. I don't find Sam Harris's view all that compelling. Maybe I used to, but definitely not as much anymore.
Since morality is really only a question about human well-being.
And that's particularly the thing. Why is human well-being, which is a thing, some sort of moral goal to optimize? I think that's particularly the question. Harris kind of defines this in a tautological way. He basically says, well, it's the only thing we could think about, or the suffering of conscious creatures. Maybe he extends it this way. But he's basically a consequentialist or utilitarian, but it's difficult to justify the sort of why about this. Okay, suppose this is the case. Why does that provide me with any reason to act? I'm not in the same conscious experience as somebody else, so why should I refrain from, robbing or stealing or whatever, just because it causes them pain? I don't experience their pain the way that I experience my own. So even under a utilitarian framework, it provides no underlying justification for motivating our behavior. It basically, morality asks us to do things, as moral philosopher George Scher, who I took class in moral philosophy from, said, morality makes demands on our behavior and it tells us to do things we just don't want to do. So you expect there to be at least some level of justification for saying why we should do some things that we don't want to do. And the question is whether it's not Sam Harris is successful in this is an interesting sort of question.
At first, I was pretty convinced that this was true, and that all religious people secretly agreed that morality really was about human well-being, even if they said that they didn't. After all, religious morality, regardless of the religion we're talking about, seems to be all about securing your spot in the afterlife. And isn't that essentially just ultimate well-being? There's nothing better than human flourishing than going to heaven, especially when pitted against hell, which was instilled in me as a kid and is still the predominant view among religious people today. But then
Yeah, I don't like making morality about heaven and hell as much. Even as a Christian, I think this can be a little bit of a distraction. I think a lot of morality is just about doing what we consider to be good or the right thing. And I do think good and right are things that are grounded in God. But if we're only doing them because we're afraid of going to hell or want to go to heaven, it seems a little too self-interested to me. I don't find that all this satisfactory. I don't go around doing good things because I want to get a better place in heaven, or avoiding doing bad things because I'm afraid of going to hell. I think some people do, but I don't think people necessarily need the threat of good and bad in that particular way. I even wrote a paper on this saying I think atheists and theists alike, both, if you ask them why they do something good or why they don't do something bad, they're going to both argue because they believe that that thing is good, not because they're afraid of going to hell or they want to get into heaven. Even an atheist who could make a sort of Pascalian wager sort of argument and say, well, I don't think most people are going to treat morality in this way. So I understand what he's saying here, but as a Christian, I think even if there was no afterlife, I would still want to do good things, so provided that God exists and that good exists. But of course, if those things don't exist, then I think the basis for these things is different and they're not really grounded in reality. But that's, once again, a different question.
Growing popularity of veganism made me question, is morality really all about human flourishing? Some vegans seem to say that morality is actually about the flourishing of all sentient living things. And besides, are we so sure that religious people actually agree that human flourishing is the basis of morality? If you speak to certain hardline religious people, they'll tell you that morality is actually all just about the glory of God.
Yeah, I don't like this point. Well, not that I say, I see what he's saying, but there's something unsatisfying if we say all of morality is just simply about glorifying God, because we could imagine, well, what if God asks us to, or commands some sort of evil or some action we think is evil? Are we necessarily responsible or morally obligated to do this? I don't know if that's necessarily the whole story. Don't get me wrong. I see where this is coming from, and I'm sure there are people that make this point. I'm partially glad I haven't really encountered too much of that. But I think I see this point about it being about glorifying God. I think one could argue the chief end of man is to know God and to glorify God, even if at least some part of morality is about what we owe to other human beings as well. I don't think it's necessarily I think saying everything about morality is just about glorifying God is at least to me, I don't know if I find that completely satisfactory, but I would need to hear more about that.
If God desired to send us to hell, that would be fair, because we deserve it. We are all sinners worthy of hell anyway. And so if God lets us into heaven, it's not because we deserve it. So we ought to act morally, not to get to heaven, but because we should glorify God, and that's what morality is all about. So if morality isn't about human flourishing, what is morality all about? To be honest, I don't think that this question has one answer.
I kind of agree here that maybe morality isn't just about one particular thing. I think if we argue what morality is, it's about, things that are good and things that are bad. And if we take this a little bit further, morality is about prescriptive type of things we ought to do and things we ought not to do. And in this, there's some level of responsibility that I think is important. That's, I think, difficult to define. But saying that the only obligation we have is to God and we don't have any obligation to our fellow creatures, I think that's maybe a false dichotomy, because perhaps part of our obligation to God is that we have obligation to our fellow creatures because we are created by God and our fellow creatures are also created by God. I think that's at least one way in which you could keep this from being too black and white of a distinction. But anyway, I don't want to belabor this point here.
Tons of answers depending on who you ask. And since I cannot make any objective claims about morality without knowing what morality is even about, I'm left with nothing. Just this intuition that morality is real and objective, even though I can't tell you what it is. And then I read this paper, Gastronomic Realism, A Cautionary Tale, by Dan Loeb from the University of Vermont, published in the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, Volume 23, Number 1 in 2000.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
Complicated history. Much less has been said, however, about realism concerning other sorts of value.
So let me just kind of summarize. This idea of gastronomic realism is just the idea that some foods are just better than other foods. And basically this paper kind of goes around trying to make almost a parallel between gastronomic realism and moral realism. And let me tell you, I'm someone who's a moral realist who's not a gastronomic realist. I personally prefer cookies and cream ice cream to, say, bacon bits ice cream, but I would not claim that cookies and cream ice cream is better objectively than bacon bits ice cream. It's better to my own preferences and tastes, but not. Whereas I argue that somebody who is going around murdering children for fun, I'm going to argue that particular action, they are doing something objectively wrong. And that's not just my opinion about it. But of course, the question becomes, how do I justify a difference between the two? And we'll talk about this in a second. But let's just kind of go through. So he talks about what gastronomic realism is, and we'll kind of see a few things that he says about it.
Is gastronomic realism? At a minimum, it's the view that gastronomic value properties, or GVPs, are real. So let's get more into the reductio part. Moral realists will often claim that there should be a presumption in favor of moral realism.
I don't actually find this compelling. I think this is jumping the gun, the idea that moral realists arguing that moral realism should be our meta-ethical starting point. I think if you're a theist, you should start with moral realism as a meta-ethical starting point. But I think if you're a naturalist, or if you've already accepted naturalism or atheism, then I believe your default meta-ethical starting point will be meta-ethical anti-realism. And the reason is you probably already defined some sort of epistemology and ontology of things that exist. And as we'll talk about later with J.L. Mackey's argument, we need to be careful that, if we're going to allow moral facts to exist, it's consistent with our ontology and epistemology. And I think if you are a theist, this makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about this in a second. If you're an atheist or an agnostic, if you believe the only way we come to truth is through some sort of scientific method, then any sort of moral claims or ought-based claims are just completely off the table. It's just, it's something you can't find with science. Obviously, Hume talked a lot about this in his is-ought distinction. G.E. Moore has his open question argument. There have been a lot of very serious challenges to this particular idea. Of course, J.L. Mackey's argument, which we'll come to in a minute as well. I personally just do not think that this is even I've just never really found any satisfactory answer from any naturalist trying to justify moral realism on these grounds. And that's why I would argue it is sort of a meta-ethical starting point from reading other naturalists arguing for this particular thing. And you have also debunking arguments from evolution, from people like Richard Joyce, and I don't know if it was Sharon Street, whoever had the evolutionary debunking arguments paper that was really influential. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point.
Based on human intuition. The paper reads, moral realists often argue that moral realism should be our meta-ethical starting point, the default view, unless decisive objections to it are found. Gastronomic realists may wish to avail themselves of a presumption of just this sort. In the spirit of their moral realist counterparts, they may ask why gastronomic realism needs a defense. Again, this sounds absurd when you're talking about gastronomic realism, but I'm not certain what the symmetry breaker is between gastronomic realism and moral realism.
Okay, that's a good point. Let me argue what I believe the symmetry breaker is between moral realism and gastronomic realism. Now, I'm not going to claim this is some sort of airtight thing, but the main thing, it has to do with teleology or telos. And this goes back all the way to Aristotle. Aristotle's idea of a telos is, what is the purpose of a thing? What is it made for? If I make a knife, its purpose is to cut. So I can tell if a knife that cuts well, that's a good knife. Knife that cuts bad is a bad knife. It has to do with its end or what its purpose is. Now, think about what humans are created for. And this is where I think we get into the naturalism versus theism thing. If you're a naturalist, you don't believe humans were created for any particular reason. You believe that in some ways they're sort of an accident an accidental byproduct of nature. There's no mind behind any of this. There's no purpose behind any of this. So there's no end or goal that humans were created for. There's no actual reason for this. And as a result, any attempt to justify morality without this sort of end, as Alistair McIntyre argued in After Virtue, which is a great book, you should totally check it out. I know I talk about it every time we talk about morality, but that's because it really changed my views on morality. So I think other people should read it because it's a very interesting and challenging book. But putting that aside, yeah, my view is you have human nature as it is. And if you need to have human nature as it ought to be, that basically implies some idea of a telos or some idea of a goal, human nature as it ought to be. And naturalism, in my argument, cannot have an end because that is an ought. That is something that cannot be discovered by science, as Hume talked about. And it's just a different kind of thing. Trying to discover it with science is just a category error. So in this particular way, if you are a theist, you believe that perhaps God created humans for some particular end, and virtue is thus how you get from the way human nature is to human nature as it ought to be, or for the way that God created it. Now, if God created stuff for a particular reason, then my idea of some human functioning poorly, like some human murdering babies for fun, being wrong, that's not just my own personal opinion on it. That's actually grounded in the proper end of a human and what it was created for. Now, of course, if we look at food, we look at gastronomic realism, we can ask the question, well, what is the purpose of food, or what is food made for? First thing to realize is you could argue there's a couple different reasons. You could argue it tastes good, it's nutritious, these sorts of things. But let's just, I think this paper is mainly looking at taste, so let's just look at taste right now and say the purpose of food is to taste good. Well, I recognize that my idea of taste is different from somebody else's idea of taste. And as a result, there's no way to sort of objectify this into some all-encompassing thing. And at this particular point, like, I recognize that my own tastes may be different than even what a majority of people find, but that still doesn't stop me from thinking that a majority of people's idea of taste is somehow superior to my own. Like, knowing that most people like, say, if most of the people in the world liked Bacon Bits ice cream, I'm still going to order cookies and cream ice cream because my taste in ice cream is what it is. And once again, this is kind of an is thing. And to make a comparison, you would need to, once again, the symmetry breaker here is tastes, there's no ought-based piece to tastes. And even if you were to do a sort of ought-based thing to taste, then you would be actually arguing for a moral type of claim. So I think this is particularly the thing. Tastes are what they are, but we don't have an ought-based thing. That's what makes moral realism separate from gastronomic realism. Oops, not mean to do that.
The paper continues. The argument from disagreement is the same. The argument from disagreement is perhaps the most prominent objection that's been raised against moral realism.
Yeah, I think this argument from disagreement against moral realism is overstated by moral non-realists, in particular because, yes, if there was no disagreement, then I think it'd be easier to argue for moral realism. But the fact that there is disagreement isn't a big challenge to moral realism in the sense that people disagree about all sorts of other things. In fact, we never have complete agreement on pretty much anything I can imagine. So this idea that just because people exist doesn't mean that there's some truth. I mean, if you're going to keep that, if the argument from disagreement is why you're not a moral realist, then you should also be a scientific anti-realist as well, because scientists don't agree on their own theories and their dissenting views. So because there are disagreements about these things, you shouldn't believe any of the scientific theories, or at least be skeptical unless everyone agrees about these things. So once again, there needs to be a symmetry breaker there to argue that one is somehow superior to another. Once again, don't get me wrong, I think it does make moral realism a little bit more challenging because you then need to do the work of saying, how do we know, and how would we know if one is more right than another? But I don't think that's enough to just basically say moral realism is false because people disagree. Well, people disagree on other things, and we still believe some of that stuff is true. So there needs to be more justification from the argument from disagreement to be a real significant challenge to moral realism.
A similar argument can be directed at gastronomic value properties. Disagreement about which foods are good are notoriously common. My son insists that caviar is awful. I find it exquisite.
Yeah, I think when we are making claims like, oh, this food is really good, I would agree with the the moral non-naturalist to say we are making an emotive claim. We aren't making a value claim. We're making a claim that's saying, when I say this food is good, I am saying that I like it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when I'm saying rape is wrong, all I'm saying is I don't like it, versus I believe I'm actually expressing a fact about the way things are and the way things ought to be.
The author does admit that he is lying, but some people do find caviar exquisite. But as moral realists often remind us, the ability to appreciate things of value, such as other people's rights and interests, may require a certain sophistication developed over long periods of time. And we can expect disagreement among the less sophisticated, or between the more and the less sophisticated.
Yeah, and this is fair too. But once again, this is another point when you compare this to scientific realism. Some people say, yeah, you would disagree with the scientific theory because you don't understand the mathematics or the mechanisms behind it. So I see the point that he's getting at, but hopefully moral realists are careful here when they're talking about moral ontology and moral epistemology, which is of course how moral facts come to exist consistent with how we believe things that do exist and what their metaphysical grounding is. And then the epistemology, how do we come to know moral facts? How can we come to know which truths are moral truths or not?
But this sort of disagreement does not threaten realism about gastronomic value properties either, or at least it threatens moral value properties the same as it threatens gastronomic value properties. Then there's the argument from explanation. The argument stems from the view very roughly that it's sensible to believe of a kind of entity or property if and only if we can fit that entity or property into our best available explanation schema. The challenge to the moral realist then is to show us how moral facts can explain and why we should believe what they explain. If there's no place for moral facts in our best global explanatory picture, then Harman's argument suggests that we would have no good reason to believe in them. No.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of this particular argument. And I'll explain because this is probably borrowing or inspired at least in part by Mackey's argument. And I'll explain where I think Mackey goes wrong. But this idea presupposes some idea of a best available explanatory schema, and often ruling out moral realism is done by begging the question in favor of naturalism, which of course will not allow moral realism to begin with. So if we're assuming naturalism is the best available explanatory schema, then of course you're not going to have moral realism, and I would agree with this. But if we're not a naturalist a priori, then I think there's more work to do to decide, well, what do we mean by the best available explanatory schema? Is this even a precise enough definition to be useful to have this conversation? That would be my thing. Well, what do we mean by a best available explanatory schema? I would need to know what this is if somebody's going to make an argument in favor of moral anti-realism.
No reason to treat our moral intuitions as having any evidentiary force. So we could apply the same things to gastronomic value properties, right? Well, moral realists like to argue that moral realism does actually explain certain things such as human behavior, but gastronomic value properties can also explain certain aspects of human behavior. Of course they can, argues the gastronomic realist. Why do people pay such high prices? Because the food is so good at that certain rate.
Yeah, I just do wonder. I mean, as somebody, I don't believe that some food is better than others, and my guess is there are a lot of people that would agree with me on this, that food is really just down to taste, and other people but still believe that moral things are not down to taste. So what exactly is the connection here between gastronomic realism and moral realism would be my question to the people in this paper. And I think they do a good job of trying to explain it, but they're not trying to make the argument that moral realism is false because gastronomic realism is an interesting challenge. I think them drawing parallels to gastronomic realism is really important and really useful, and we need to be careful if we're moral realists to make sure that any objections to our claim are not, or, what we're saying would also not apply for something like gastronomic realism, which, as Kevin mentions, is kind of a reductio ad absurdum to this.
Restaurant. Why hasn't Ben & Jerry's come out with a ketchup and onion flavored ice cream? Because that would be an awful flavor, an objectively awful flavor. There is a point in the paper where he takes the argument from Queerness on. I'm going to skip that because, frankly, I don't understand the argument from Queerness very well.
So I think this is super important, so I will try to do my best to explain it. So the argument for Queerness is basically J.L. Mackey saying that if objective moral facts existed, they would be really queer and different from anything else in the universe, is Mackey's claim. And the way he says it is like this. In his book, Ethics, Inventing Right or Wrong, he says, quote, if there were objective values, they would be of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe, yet we have no philosophically satisfying account either of the existence of such things or of how we could come to know about them. Therefore, we should not believe in objective values, end quote. Now, Mackey's argument is resting quite a bit on induction, the idea of we should believe things that we have more support for or more experience with. And his argument that is that moral facts are not one of those things. There's nothing quite like moral facts in the world. Now, I think this, once again, depends on what place you're particularly coming from. If you're coming from naturalism, I think Mackey's argument absolutely has a lot of force. Like, they're just these magical facts that exist that we can't detect with any scientific method, and somehow they're able to magically affect our brains to come to moral truth. How does this kind of make any sense? That's a fair argument. I think that is a fair challenge to a naturalistic sort of thing. But of course, you could argue same thing with mathematics or any sort of knowledge at all. There could be this epistemic piece of it. Now, one thing I should mention is notice how Mackey's argument is actually self-defeating epistemically. He is basically claiming, once again, we should not believe in objective values because we have no philosophically satisfying account of how they exist and of how we come to know about them. The problem here is we have no philosophically satisfying account really of what I would argue of what knowledge is. People are still arguing about this. And also we have no philosophically satisfying account of why we should only believe things that we have a philosophically satisfying account for and disbelieve things. This is the key, because Mackey's saying we should not believe in objective values. So what Mackey's basically, his epistemology is telling him to say is we should not believe things we don't have a philosophically satisfying account for, and argue Mackey hasn't given us a philosophically satisfying account to accept that as epistemology, which he's using to reject the existence of objective values. So his argument is actually self-defeating. But the thing that Mackey calls attention to, which I think is really important, is the fact that he's basically saying, yeah, moral facts are like a weird thing. And I would agree with him on that. They're just ways we ought to act. And how do we come to know these ways that we ought to act? Especially if you're a naturalist, I hope you can understand the force of his argument and what he's trying to say here, because I think that's really important. If you guys have questions about this, let me know in the comments, because yeah, I really like Mackey's argument. I really like Mackey. I think he's a great philosopher.
And then the paper ends with a confession. I confess, says the author, that when I began this project, I was more tempted by the possibility of such a reductio than I am now. On more careful reflection, I think it is wiser to withhold judgment on that question.
Yeah, I could totally understand. I think that's actually super fair to just basically say, yeah, like, you start thinking about it, you start saying, yeah, wait, there seem to be these connections. And as you start spelling them out, you start realizing, hey, well, maybe there's a point the moral realist could say this is a difference here. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit ad hoc, but you don't know until you actually see the arguments and have the conversation. So respect to him for admitting that and just kind of making that claim. And he kind of goes through I like how he ends the paper too. Realism is no harder to swallow than moral realism is. I think it's just kind of a funny thing. I mean, like I said, I would argue that I think gastronomic realism is a harder thing to accept than moral realism, but he's using harder to swallow as kind of a wordplay, which, kudos to that. That's funny. Let's see. Okay, now let's see what Kevin's concluding thoughts are.
Reductio ad absurdum approach. I don't think that the reasons to accept moral realism are very good, and if they were good, that would probably prompt me to accept gastronomic realism as well. But I'm not a gastronomic realist. I'm not a moral realist either. I've discarded both through Occam's razor, and I'm left being a moral anti-realist.
Yeah, and I think here's where the problem is once again, take our claim something really we find morally abhorrent, like somebody who believes rape is wrong and somebody else who believes rape is okay if it makes me feel good. If Kevin's going to be a moral anti-realist, he has to basically say both of these claims are equally legitimate, or, they're both just have the same evidential support. One is not better or more right than another. And I think there's something about this that's really deeply unsatisfying to me. And I'm sure Kevin would agree with this. Now, I appreciate being consistent about this, and being consistent about this because you're like, okay, if moral realism exists, do I have to decide between deciding that rape is actually wrong and that there are some foods that are better than others? But once again, I think there are options that I don't think these are necessarily the same thing. So I don't think you have to choose between one or another in that particular way. Keep in mind also, it goes further than this. It's not just, people who believe these things are legitimate, have equal legitimacy. It's that somebody following moral rules when they actually believe not following these rules, if they're a moral anti-realist, would cause them to be happier or feel better, is actually acting irrationally. They're actually acting superstitious and irrationally because they're following principles that they don't believe exist. It's the same argument that naturalists and atheists use against religious believers and against people who believe in horoscopes and these sorts of things. It's like, yeah, if you believe that moral facts don't exist and you're tempering your behavior according to them, even though you don't actually believe they exist, yeah, you're acting irrationally when you follow these beliefs because you don't actually believe they exist. And if your epistemology causes these things to be false, then you should not follow them if you're trying to be consistent. Now, once again, I find this unsatisfying. I'm unhappy, but I would argue this is just the logical conclusion of naturalism and moral anti-realism. That is what it is. So I'm going to follow Kai Nielsen in his book, Ethics Without God. He's an atheist, but he says this, right? Quote, "It is more reasonable to believe such elemental things such as wife beating and child abuse to be evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his or her moral beliefs." Now, I understand what Kevin's going to do is discard the actual truth of moral realism with respect to Occam's razor, and I understand this. But if I have to choose between using Occam's razor and using Occam's machete to cut away some of my deepest held moral beliefs, yeah, I'm going to be more cautious discarding these beliefs if the logical implication of them is that certain things I just feel like I can reasonably know to be wrong are actually wrong. And if accepting a certain epistemology or ontological assumption about the world leads to these views to nothing really being right or wrong and everything basically being permissible, then I would argue that's a reductio ad absurdum to whatever metaphysical, ontological, or epistemic starting point I had. So that's my view on that particular matter.
You know what's funny, too, is that Sam Harris makes an analogy to food in the TED Talk that he did about 10 years ago, shortly after The Moral Landscape was published. He says,
notice that the fact that the concept of health is open, genuinely open for revision, does not make it vacuous. The distinction between a healthy person and a dead one is about as clear and consequential as any we make in science. Now, another...
Yeah, and once again, I would agree with Sam Harris that, yeah, we do have a general idea of health, but once again, morality is different because these are ought-based claims, whereas just the idea of health that's an is-based claim, like this is a healthy person. Yeah, I think that's particularly the difference, and I think that's where Harris is missing out. So let's see how Kevin concludes his video.
Well, Sam Harris strikes me as a gastronomic realist. Very consistent of you, Sam.
I agree.
That might not quite be true because Sam substitutes the word nutrition in. I do agree that there are truths to be known about human nutrition, just as I agree that there are truths to be known about human flourishing.
I would agree that even if you're a moral anti-realist, you can believe that there are truths to be known about human flourishing. You just may not believe that there's any particular moral reason or any ought-based reason to follow those in any particular way, right? I can recognize that my action of eating a steak is killing a cow. That is a statement that there is death involved into what is being put on my plate. But recognizing that isn't enough to get me to, change my behavior and become a vegan or a vegetarian. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Once again, going from these is to these ought type of claims that actually make demands on our behavior is a different kind of thing.
And if you mean human flourishing, when you say morality, then yeah, I can be a moral realist or a moral realist. But I think that the more precise way of phrasing that is that I could be a human flourishing realist, not a moral realist, since I don't think that everybody agrees about what morality is. And until we do, I don't think that I can call myself a moral realist.
And at this point, I think this is just too high of an evidential standard to say that agreement is reasonable to expect, and as a result, we should refrain from judgment until we have some sort of agreement. I mean, there's not even agreement that the world is flat, and yet I don't withhold judgment on this. I do believe that the earth is round, and I believe that there are arguments for this, and sure, that perhaps it's open to revision, but that's kind of what it is. So the fact that there is disagreement, I guess the question is, how much agreement, Kevin, would be enough for you if you wanted to be a moral realist for you to accept moral realism? And is it the fact that there's disagreement on whether or not moral realism is true, or disagreement on the actual properties of these moral things in particular? I think that's an interesting question. And that's not a question I'm going to expect an answer for. I think it's just an interesting question for us to think about. That's really kind of the thing. To be honest, I find moral realism intuitively plausible, and I find other facts intuitively plausible as well, like 2 + 2 = 4, or the result of any sort of logical conclusion. Just because I can't give an argument for all of the beliefs that I has doesn't necessarily make them irrational. To argue that they were irrational would be something that somebody would need would bear the burden of proof for.
That's it for today, everybody. I really like putting these kinds of videos together. I like telling you what I actually believe instead of just what I don't believe. So if you like these two, drop a comment down below. If you disagree with me, let me know. If you're a Catholic and you think that I'm just...
Anyway, yeah. So I guess in that sense, yeah, I do disagree with you because I am a moral realist, but I appreciate your thinking about this. I appreciate you putting this video together. And yeah, thanks to the rest of y'all for watching, and have a good one.